In this video, we're going to talk about the cytoskeleton. And if we break down this word, we can look at the prefix of cyto, and cyto refers to cell. And then if we think of the word skeleton, we can think of bones. Now, individual cells don't have bones in the way that humans have bones, but they do have structures that act as support structures. So they kind of act like bones of the cell. And so we can think of this as really the bones and also kind of the muscles of the cell, because the cytoskeleton is involved in both structure and movement associated with the cell. So what structures make up the cytoskeleton? The cytoskeleton is made up of fibrous proteins. And what we mean by fibrous is that they're mostly these kind of long string-like or rope-like proteins. So they're kind of these stringy, long proteins. And there are three types of proteins that make up the cytoskeleton. So the first one we're going to talk about are actin filaments, also called microfilaments. The second kind we're going to talk about are intermediate filaments. And the last kind are microtubules. And each of these protein filaments differ in their structure and their function, although they do all work together in order to provide the cytoskeleton. When we talk about the cytoskeleton being the bones and the muscles of the cell, what we mean by that is that the cytoskeleton, first of all, provides support for the cell. So the bones, kind of like the bones in the human body, it just provides support. This can also determine the shape of the cell. So some cells are round, other cells are like cubes, some are kind of long and skinny, and so the shape is partially determined by the cytoskeleton. The muscle part of the cytoskeleton has to do with the fact that the cytoskeleton is involved in movement. So it could be the movement of the cell itself. So you think about like an amoeba is able to kind of move around in its environment and engulf other cells. You can also look at cells called phagocytes. And phagocytes are immune cells that are able to move around. And once again, they can engulf foreign particles like bacteria in order to kind of neutralize them so they can't make you sick. The cytoskeleton also allows organelles to move around inside the cell. So a lot of them act as kind of like public transit. All right, so things like tracks in order for organelles to be transported around inside the cell. And so this is important, for example, with vesicles. Transport vesicles help to move items that are produced by maybe one organelle and then deliver it to a different organelle in the cell. And these vesicles can be carried along these different protein fibers in order to get from one area to the other. When a cell divides in two during a process known as mitosis or meiosis or any sort of kind of cell division, these cytoskeleton components, these proteins, are involved in moving chromosomes around and moving organelles around and ultimately pinching the cell into two new cells. So the first protein filament of the cytoskeleton that we're going to focus in on are the actin filaments. And these are also called microfilaments, and they are the smallest of the three types of proteins that we're going to talk about. If you look at this image here that I brought in from the OpenStax biology textbook, you can see that actin filaments are kind of like two beaded necklaces that are wrapped around each other. So each one of these circles is actually a globular protein, But then it's connected to more of these globular proteins until it makes a string. And then there's two of those strings kind of wrapped around each other, almost in a helix type formation. So oftentimes actin filaments, they either form these kind of long stringy proteins, or sometimes they form a mesh. And when they form this mesh-like network, it helps to provide structural support for the cell membrane. And so the mesh is typically anchored to the inside of the cell membrane, so on the cytoplasmic side. In order to provide support. The long string-like actin filaments can also interact with other molecules known as motor molecules. And so actin actually typically works with a motor molecule called myosin. And in working together, they can help to produce movement in the cell. So, some examples of movement that is accomplished with actin and myosin working together are things like muscle contractions. Actin and myosin also helps to kind of circulate or move chloroplast around in plant cells. Actin filaments are also responsible for pinching a cell in two during cell division. So during cell division, called mitosis or meiosis, and we'll talk more about the specifics of mitosis and meiosis in a different video. But during cell division, what happens is that you start with a single cell that ultimately starts to kind of form almost like a peanut shape. And that's because the cell membrane is starting to pinch in the middle. And it's actually the actin filaments that are pinching in that middle so that you ultimately end up with two separate cells that have been pinched apart from each other. The next protein that's part of the cytoskeleton that we're going to talk about are the intermediate filaments. And they are called this because they are kind of intermediate in size in between the actin filaments, which are also called microfilaments, which are smaller, and the microtubules, which are bigger than the intermediate filaments. Now, all of these are molecules, so they're all very, very small, but relative to each other, the actin filaments are the smallest, intermediate filaments are middle, and the microtubules are the largest. So if we look at the structure of these intermediate filaments, we can see that they're made up of multiple protein fibers that are kind of wrapped around each other like a rope. And so you can see that this is one protein fiber right here, and another one, and then you've got another one kind of back here. So remember that with actin, we had kind of these individual, almost like beaded necklaces that were wrapped around each other. But with the case of these intermediate filaments, each one of those proteins is its own kind of string, and then those strings get wound together in order to make this rope-like structure. And some of the functions of the intermediate filaments include providing support to the nuclear envelope and the cell membrane, they're involved in producing intercellular junctions. And what we mean by intercellular junctions is These are proteins that help to hold adjacent cells together. So we'll talk more about intercellular junctions when we talk more about the cell membrane and how cells are actually kind of attached to each other in order to form tissues. But then we'll refer back to these intermediate filaments because they are the proteins involved in making these connections between neighboring cells. Another function of these intermediate filaments is that it provides the cells with strength. So an example of an intermediate filament is a protein called keratin. And you've maybe heard of this before because you can get keratin treatments for your hair. And keratin is just a protein that's found in usually in like the skin and the nails and the hair. It also makes up things like the horn of a rhino or the coating or the covering of a shell of a turtle. So it's a very versatile protein found kind of throughout the animal kingdom. And it is actually a type of intermediate filament that helps to provide that strength associated with that structure. And the third protein associated with the cytoskeleton that we're going to talk about are the microtubules. Now, even though it starts with the prefix of micro, these are actually the largest of the three proteins that we're talking about associated with the cytoskeleton. So you can see in this picture here that the microtubules are made up of these kind of globular proteins. So each one of these spheres here would be a protein molecule, but then they kind of stick together like a beaded necklace, kind of like actin, but you see that they actually form this kind of hollow cylinder or hollow cylindrical structure of these kind of protein fibers here. And so the inside here is actually hollow. So it's almost like a hollow tube of spherical proteins kind of formed into this cylindrical type shape. Most eukaryotic cells have a structure known as a centrosome, and the centrosome is actually what produces the microtubules in these eukaryotic cells. These microtubules also act as kind of like train tracks in order for other molecules to be able to move around inside the cell. And so those other molecules, that includes things like organelles. In another video, we're going to talk more about cell division, which includes things like mitosis and meiosis. When we talk about those events, when we talk about that cell division, we're going to talk about something called the mitotic spindle. And the mitotic spindle is actually made up of those centrosomes making these microtubules. And the primary function of the mitotic spindle is that it helps to move the chromosomes around during cell division so that the new cells each get a set of chromosomes. Another important thing to note about microtubules is that they also work with motor molecules in order to allow this movement to occur. And the motor molecules that work with microtubules are called kinesin and dynein. So recall that when we talked about actin, we said that actin worked with a motor molecule known as myosin, whereas with microtubules, the motor molecules are known as kinesin and dynein. So in summary, we're talking about the cytoskeleton and referring to the structure of the cytoskeleton is made up of three different types of proteins. We have actin, which are also called microfilaments. We have intermediate filaments. And we have microtubules. And each of these varies in their size and shape and arrangement of proteins, with actin being the smallest of the three, and microtubules being the largest of the three. And even though they have different specific structures and functions, overall they share some kind of common general functions. So they give cells shape, they support the cells or support structures in the cells, they allow the cells to move, they also allow for movement of organelles within the cell. And in another video, we will be talking more about the role that these molecules have in cell division. And more specifically, we'll be talking about mitosis and meiosis. And so the cytoskeleton proteins are involved in moving structures around so that cells can divide.